Shall I begin? Shall I begin?
Yes, Angie, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Angelica Mendoza. I'm a business development manager at Effective, the translation and localization company, and I'm going to be moderator of this webinar. It is called Human Evaluation in the Selection of the Best Machine Translation Engine, Traditional Approach and New Methodology. It is another installment in our series of webinars on practical application of modern translation, localization, and interpretation technologies. The webinar will be conducted by Stepan Korotayev, our CTO and head of R&D. During the webinar, your mics and cameras will be switched off, but you can type in questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll address your questions during a dedicated Q&A session at the end of our webinar. During the webinar, we'll run several short polls to better understand our audience and its needs. We'll be very grateful if you take a minute to participate in these polls. It will help us in developing future webinars, addressing more specific needs and use cases. Please note that this session will be recorded and then sent to all participants for future reference. And now I'll hand it over to Stepan.
Thanks, Angie. Hello, everyone. Happy to have you here. Our today's discussion follows my last week's presentation at AMTA in Orlando. And the topic is the same, but today we'll have slightly more time, so I'll be able to elaborate on some of the key points. And of course, we'll hope that I'll be able to refrain from abusing this opportunity and stay within some reasonable time frame. And I promise I will. Before we start, I need to mention that this presentation is based on a paper co-authored by Andrei Rabchikov, who's lead NLP specialist here at Effective, and myself. And kudos to Andrei for his contribution to this research. He was instrumental in developing a methodology and also in doing all the groundwork. And by the way, Andrei is at hand today. So if you want to ask some more specific technical questions, he'll be able to answer them. And all you need to do is to press the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Okay, so with that intro behind us, let me say a couple of words about our company. We're a translation, localization, interpretation company with a very strong focus on R&D, including machine translation, of course. And I put some of our services on the slide. And I also know that this is probably the most boring part of any presentation, when you're forced to hear someone bragging like this. So let me just make it a bit more engaging and run our first poll today to learn maybe a bit more about our audience and who you are. So I would greatly appreciate it if you could take a second to participate. Now I'm running. Let me just give me a sec. Okay, so I'm running this poll and you should be able to see it on your screens. And maybe you need to scroll down a bit to see all the options, other being the last of them. So take your time. I'll give you, if you have a minute, to complete it. Okay. Answers are coming in. Maybe a bit more time. Okay, thank you. I'm ending this and also sharing results. Okay, so translation companies, and large business, the overwhelming majority. Okay, thank you for your participation in our poll. And let's move on. So this whole presentation is about the concept of human evaluation. So it's a part of the process where we need to choose the best MT engine out of several and possibly dozens alternatives. So probably I should first say a couple of words on the concept of human evaluation itself. And before I move to the next slide, I probably should warn you that many images for this presentation were generated by DALL-E Mini. It's an AI service that generates images based on text prompts. So please have mercy and don't be judgmental. Okay, so here we go. The first one. So human evaluation is usually the second step in the process after several candidate engines were selected based on automatic metrics. And you probably know these magical words like BLEU, COMET, BERT score. And metrics are more or less unavoidable as you need a way to narrow the selection down to something practical, visible. And we're not going to discuss metrics during this presentation. Suffice it to say that once several engines are selected, that's where human evaluation kicks in to deal with outliers, fine-tune results, and ultimately determine a winner. We need this stage of human evaluation because first, leading engines usually score very closely based on automatic metrics. It's hard to say which one is better when we deal with mere fractions of a unit. And second, we just want a qualified human linguist to be present somewhere in this picture, because AI is great, but we still trust people more in some respects. Okay, so how is this human evaluation thing usually done? But before we go there and take a look at the standard approach, let's do another poll. And again, I would appreciate it very much if you could take a minute of your time. Let me run it. Okay, so what's your role in your organization? And again, maybe you might need to scroll down a bit to see all the options. Okay, I see that people are taking this seriously, putting some effort in, and answers are coming. Thank you for that. It's really helpful. Okay, let me end this poll for now and share results. Localization managers, huh? Several executive level people. Good to know. Okay, and a bit cryptic other. Okay, thank you for that. And now let's go back to our topic. So what's the standard approach to human evaluation? Well, in a nutshell, it's when a number of sentences produced by different engines are sent to human reviewers along with instructions, often very, very elaborate. And then each reviewer is asked to categorize those segments, which means assign them a category, choose a type of error, if errors are present, of course, in a segment, and do similar stuff around those segments. The very process of categorizing is not so typical for the translation industry, unlike such processes as translation or editing, for example. So it's not very easy to find people able to do it well enough. And again, a lot of training is needed to make sure your reviewers understand their task right and are able to deliver quality that you expect. The whole process requires a lot of decisions. of course, and they need to be made on a set of standalone, out of context, often very similar sentences. You have to always ask yourself, is this segment good enough or not? Does it contain this type of error or that? And of course, having to make all those decisions on very similar sentences leads to fatigue, and as a consequence, random choices at some point on part of reviewers. So you have to make constant decisions, and there is a limit after which this process can become very arbitrary. Reviewers are also requested, in most cases, to post-edit some sentences or segments, and those are typically translations of the same source sentence provided by competing engines. So the same person is asked to change a sentence translated by, say, Google or Engine 1, as you can see on this slide, and then Microsoft or Engine 2, and then Amazon, whatever it is, and then another engine and yet another. And all of those versions can be very similar, as they are translations of the same source sentence. But a reviewer is asked not only to change each and every version to a desired state, again, whatever it is, but they are also asked to do it in a unique way, unique, non-repetitive way, because it would be very natural, of course, to change one version and then just copy paste this amended text to all other versions. So say on this slide, to change everything that needs to be changed for translation by Engine 1, and then copy paste it to translation by Engine 2, and it'll do it in terms of getting this final version of your sentence in a more or less adequate way. But it's a big no-no, of course, because it defeats the purpose of uniquely addressing each of the translation versions. So we need to see where their weaknesses are, their strengths are. So all those changes should be made on a per segment basis. In a way, a reviewer is asked to imagine that they haven't seen this sentence before and change each time from scratch. And obviously, you can ask people to do things like this, but it's quite unlikely that they'll be able to deliver high quality. So we've gone through some of the downsides of a common methodology. The main of them is that it's just very hard to ensure objectiveness and predictability of results. Monotonous work leads to fatigue, and fatigue leads to arbitrary choices. And on top of that, it's also pretty hard to find people even inclined to do this job. What could be an alternative approach? And I'll come to it in a minute, but first, let's do our last poll today. If you don't mind, again, please take a minute to participate. And this is the last one, I promised. So let me launch it. It's about machine translation processes at your organization. So have you implemented them? Have you used machine translation as part of your productivity toolset or otherwise? Let us know. Yeah, and again, you might want to scroll down a bit to see all the options. Okay, okay. I can already see that the predominant option is being the second one. But only, yes, implemented, but only for certain workflows, products, markets. Okay, so let me end it for now, right? And share results. And here we are. Okay, again, thank you very much for your activity and for your participation. Okay, so now back to our alternative methodology. So what could it be? We've come up with an idea to do away with instructions and categorization of errors altogether. Instead, we solely rely on productivity metrics obtained through a regular post-editing process. This was the idea, and let's see how it might work. First of all, because we wanted to go away from standalone sentences as well, and instead have our post editors review cohesive texts, at least several paragraphs, right, which make up something connected and comprehensible with enough context. So how could you do this? So how do you make up those texts for your post editors to work with? And I'll come to it a bit later, but the idea behind this methodology on the whole is that if we could give a post editor, say, 2 or 3 such cohesive, more or less long texts, each translated by a different engine, we could then measure which text took more effort from each post editor and then draw conclusions about quality. However, if we just randomly pick several texts, it might happen that one of them would be just much more complex than others. And it will skew the results, of course, as a more complex text might require more effort, even if it's translated better than others. That's why we first need to find what we call homogeneous texts, which means texts that we have reasons to believe have comparable level of complexity. To be able to do that, we've developed, and you guessed it, a separate methodology. You can see some of the metrics we used for that on this slide. And these are mostly about readability and general textual statistics. You can find more about it on GitHub, and the link to our research will be on the last slide of this presentation. So just several of the metrics, I won't go deep into it, but just an outline of this part of our research. Another important dimension is, of course, terminology and its density. Imagine we have 3 documents of approximately the same complexity, and they are post-edited by the same editor. We need to make sure that there aren't many terms that are shared across all these documents. Otherwise, it's going to be much harder when you deal with the first occurrence of each term, and then you'll just reuse it. And it'll skew the results as well, as the first document in a kit, and your review kit, as we call it, will inevitably require more effort to figure out this terminology side. So we processed our presumably homogeneous documents to check for properties related to terminology. It was based on 2 main principles. First of all, homogeneous texts should not have a significant number of shared terms. And they also must have approximately the same density of terminology, which means the same number of terms per unit of length. And of course, to check for terminology, we first had to extract terms to create a list of them. And as many of you probably know, it's a tricky process, and there is no silver bullet for that. So we used a combination of techniques, extracted just individual frequent words, collocations, terms based on part of speech properties, all suitable bigrams, and overall a total of 7 methods of term extraction were used. And then we created subclusters based on the percentage of shared terms and the number of occurrences of extracted terms. Okay, so let's assume the methodology there, and we now have 2 homogeneous texts translated by different engines. How do we evaluate relative quality here? Well, we can just let a post editor work with each of the translations and measure their productivity. In the end, this is the only thing that matters. The better the output of an empty engine, the less effort is required to post-edit it to a desired level. Time, of course, is the ultimate measurement, but it's not always easy to track it. So in our methodology, we used other metrics as well. The effort exerted by a particular editor working with a given text was measured as time spent plus the edit distance plus the percentage of change segments. So we used these three metrics together. And I'll touch later on how we standardized these metrics so we could actually add them up. But at this point, these three metrics, take note of them. They'll come up later. Okay, so with the methodology in place, or hopefully so, why not carry out an experiment, right? And that's exactly what we did. We decided on a language pair, domain, and quite importantly, the volume of our texts. We needed each post editor to work on several homogeneous texts, and we didn't want those texts to be too long. Well, the idea was to have them long enough for the results to be relevant, but also short enough that an editor could work with them in one go without getting too tired. Because when you're tired, obviously your productivity tends to go down, and we didn't want that to be yet another factor. For our experiment, we decided to compare Amazon and Google, two of the most well-known engines. Both were baseline models without any customization on our side. We also added a good human translation for benchmarking purposes. And it's a common trick to make sure the results hold water. Because the idea is, if we have a good human translation, it must require less effort from an editor than even a very good machine translation. And if it's not so, then something not right in your methodology and your approach. Or maybe it's the so-called human parity after all. And by the way, this is where a traditional methodology also might get you in trouble. In most cases, for benchmarking, it uses segments from a large translation memory or other parallel corpus. And of course, first, the quality is not guaranteed in a large corpus, which might lead to kind of odd situations when a machine translated segment can be deemed even better than a reference segment based on the amount of work they both required from a post editor. Does it speak to the quality of machine translation? No, rather to the poor quality of the reference. And of course, we can try and take it into account somehow, but it further complicates the whole evaluation thing and can skew results. And second, and this is often overlooked, we used to thinking of our translation memories as something pristine, right? Human translated at the very least. But we all know better. Large TMs get contaminated inevitably over time. And your translators have long become post editors in their own right, even if they don't tell you that. They use whatever they have access to, maybe just your vanilla browser-based Google Translate to improve their productivity, copy-paste it back and forth. And so large TMs with a very high likelihood contain a lot of machine translated segments. And if you use it as your reference, again, it makes the whole thing very dubious at best. And again, you can try and find those segments in your large translation memory and to exclude them. But again, it's another step that you have to take, and the results are not guaranteed. That's why we curated our human benchmark, double-checked it for quality, and made sure it had no visible trace of machine translation. Of course, we were able to do that because it was, well, quite short, only about 6 pages. But this is the beauty of this approach. And by the way, this whole topic of how we can work around the problem of unsanctioned, as we call it, machine translation on part of your translators in various localization or translation workflows, not just for the evaluation purposes. It's very interesting and definitely merits a separate webinar. So let us know if you'd like to see it happen. Okay, so we now have our contestants, Google, Amazon, and these human translator, double checked for quality. And now we need some homogeneous texts to evaluate on. To find them, we turned for this experiment, we turned to a publicly available book, which is called The Big Data Agenda. And because texts from the same book have a higher chance of being equal in complexity. Of course, it doesn't mean that any two random excerpts will be homogeneous. So we performed a number of processing steps to arrive at our final homogeneous texts, or docs, as we call them. And again, you can find more about it on GitHub. We've got a description of all steps there. I see that one of our participants raised their hand. But if you don't mind, could you write your question using the Q&A button? Or maybe our panelists will be able to address this question. Andrei, Angie, please take a look. Okay, so I wouldn't like to break the flow at this moment, if you don't mind. But we can also always address your question later. Okay, so having three docs that we've picked out of this book, we then shuffled them as shown on this slide. Each post editor, and there were 6 of them, worked with the same docs in the same order. So editor 1 worked with doc 1, doc 2, doc 3, and same for editor 2, 3, etc. But the combination of translators, if I can use this word, was unique for each post editor, right? So the order in which these docs were translated by different participants was different. And we opted for this combinatorial approach to test our procedure used to establish homogeneity. Because if it turned out that doc 1, for example, would always require more effort from each post editor, it could point to the fact that this doc was just more complex than others. In other words, it wouldn't speak to the quality of a translation, rather to the complexity of source material. And of course, we hope that our methodology would prevent this from happening, but we're very intrigued to see if the actual results would support our expectations. Effort spent by each post editor working with each document was to be calculated across 3 parameters, as I already mentioned. Time, distance, and percentage of change segments. And if we needed an averaged value, we just divided an aggregate effort by 3, because we had 3 metrics. It is very important to note, and this is probably one of the most important slides in this presentation, it's important to note that all effort values were relative. It didn't really matter to us if an editor changed a lot in all documents or was more superficial in their changes. We only wanted to see how effort was distributed across the 3 documents that an editor worked with, and which of them, of the documents, that is, required more effort than others. To calculate relative effort, we just divided the effort for a document by an average value for all 3 documents in each post editor's review kit. And probably it can be better visualized, understood, if you just take a look at the upper row of the upper table here. So you see this mean column, just an average of the doc 1, doc 2, doc 3 percentages. And so for doc 1, for example, we just divide this value by this mean to arrive at our ratio to mean. So this was our metric, ratio to mean. It's not very scientifically strict, but it was good for our purposes and provided useful results. So as you can see on the slide, Jane and Jack, of course, it's just an example, showed a very similar distribution of relative effort, even though their absolute values were very, very different. So Jane seems to be much more diligent, but for both of them, it was doc 1 that required the most effort within their review kit. And relative to other documents, it was roughly the same proportion. So if both Jane and Jack worked with review kits where doc 1 was translated by, say, Nginx, we can conclude that this engine consistently offered worse quality than its competitors, because it required more effort on part of our reviewers. Okay, now let's move to the results of our experiment. First of all, we were very interested to see if our homogeneity methodology held water and proved its worth. It would have been overthrown if it turned out that one of the documents consistently required much more effort than others. And remember, we shuffled the translations, so each doc was translated by different engines or a human, and average values were expected to be very similar. Ideally, we would hope for the average values to be within the same confidence interval for all docs. And of course, it depends on your interval. I'd say that our docs proved to be homogeneous enough, though you can see that doc 3 required more effort on average. On the whole, more experiments are needed to see how effective this separate methodology to establish homogeneity is. And we'll definitely carry them out in the future. Now, let's move to the human benchmark. And we would be in a very strange place if our curated double-checked human translation turned out all of a sudden to be topped by any of the engines. And it didn't happen. As you can see, the human version of each of the texts in each of the review kits consistently required less effort than any of the other two docs. I can't say that it's a breakthrough result in science, but it just corroborates that the methodology, at least it doesn't provide some absurd results. And we have this benchmark in place and aligned in the right way. On this slide, you can see average values, but as we'll see later, editor to editor, the results are pretty conclusive as well. As for the engines themselves, right, and I understand that this is probably the most intriguing part for many of you, we can say it was a close fight, but Google came out on top for this language pair and domain. The average effort for Google translated docs was lower, which again is better because the lesser your effort, the better your quality. And moving on to the next slide, we can see the distribution of places in each post editor's review kit, and it's also in favor of Google. Note the dominance of the human translation. Right? Let me just highlight it for you here, right? Not very nice. So it required less effort 6 times out of 6. So for each of our 6 post editors, whichever text in their review kit of 3 texts was translated by a human translator, it always required less effort based on our metrics than the other 2. And similarly, when we compare Google and Amazon, Amazon required more effort than Google in 4 cases out of 6. So again, it's a close fight, but kind of conclusive that Google scored a bit higher based on both metrics, this place distribution and also the average effort. All right, so we're nearing the end of this presentation, by the way, and so let's move to some more general takeaways. On the whole, I would say that the methodology seems to provide results in line with its main objective, which is to help select an engine requiring less effort from a post editor. Because in the real world, all you need is less effort. More effort means more costly processes, less efficiency, slower turnaround times, et cetera, et cetera. And since we totally relied on the results of a regular post-editing process, we bypassed this need to create and send out elaborate instructions. And we also were able to carry this experiment out in a very quick fashion. In fact, we didn't even mention that this job was any different than any other to our post editors when we assigned them this job. So for them, it was just another regular job, and we wanted it this way. What else? The combinatorial approach that we used, where we shuffled all the translations and created, and it's a factorial, right? So it's, in our case, it was 3 factorial 6. But of course, it's best suited for 1-2 engine setups. It can be further modified to include more engines, but as it stands, the methodology is perfect for evaluation of human parity claims and results of custom training. So a couple of words on what human parity is. It's when we assume, or someone assumes, that the resulted raw machine output is of comparable quality with a good, equally of the same quality as a good human translation. And it's very hard, so these claims are heard once in a while, but it's very, very hard to verify. Well, this methodology provides a way to do that. Just create 2 homogeneous documents, let one of them be translated by machine and the other by a good human translator, and then have several post editors work on these 2 documents, homogeneous, of course, and then check the results and see who came out on top. And also for scenarios where we have a model that underwent some training, what it was before this training, what it is now, and again, we can find several texts and have them translated by different versions of your model, and then check which one is better. Another interesting line of research would be to compare results of our methodology with a more traditional one, and then analyze for potential differences. So where these methodologies provide similar or identical results, where they differ from each other. And of course, I don't mean to say that our methodology can replace everything else. It's just another piece, maybe another piece in this puzzle. So it can come in very handy in some situations when you need your process of human evaluation be more fluent, less dependent on instructions and on personnel, on different bottlenecks that inevitably come up in almost any evaluation process. Okay, so this is it. Thank you very much for your attention, and please feel free to get in touch. You can find a detailed description of our methodology and the whole experiment on GitHub, along with code samples and everything else. Just scan the QR code on the right or use the link. And the paper is already out. It's published in the proceedings for this year's AMTA. And now is the time to start our Q&A session. I'm not sure we'll have enough time for it today. It depends on your activity, but we'll certainly answer all your questions. If not now, then later via email or addressing them in our future webinars. Angie, the floor is yours again.
Thank you. We do have one question from Adam, and I'll go ahead and speak his text. Great presentation. You have understandably made your comparisons using complete documents. However, in a continuous localization setting, often materials are translated in small chunks, 37 software strings, for example. Were you able to run any tests with that set of conditions? ?
Yeah.
This would necessitate changing the assumptions to include TM or a trained corpus. The goal I'm thinking of is better to not have localization be a time drag against ongoing development if one can update the finished product easily in the full application context. So better to be translated up to date on Monday and corrected by Wednesday Is that poor assumption from your perspective? Question mark. End
Right.
comment.
Yeah. Thank you, Angie, and thank you, Adam, for your question. Well, it all makes sense and very valid points on your part, Adam. But I would say that the purpose of this methodology is to find the best solution for a domain and language pair once and for some foreseeable future. So it's not about how we can find the best model right now for another chunk of our continuous localization and delivery, right? It's rather about understanding the domain in which these localization strings exist. So say it's software strings or whatever you label it. And then you understand your language pair, English to Spanish. And then you made a deliberate effort to find the best engine among all available that would create the most value for you in this language pair, in this domain. And you can definitely find a cohesive text that, or maybe not so cohesive, but including various software strings, for example, and test on these texts. And once you've made this decision to go with this engine X for your project, then you just keep training it and using it. So this methodology is not about making these decisions on the fly. It's rather a decision that's made once for a certain period of time, and then you just stick to your engine. I hope I answered your question, but feel free to get in touch if you have further comments.
Thank you. I do have a couple of questions for you as well. Could you elaborate on why it's important the samples are homogeneous, as you call it?
Yeah, very good question. Thank you for that. Well, you see, this whole concept is based on leveling the field, so to speak. So we don't want any variables except for those that are connected to productivity. If the texts that we use are homogeneous, it means they are of similar complexity, and none of them would require more effort than the other, or at least significantly more effort than the other. And we can go back to the core concept. We don't want our post editors work with several versions of the same source text. We want each of them to work with a unique text, or rather several unique texts. And we want all of those several texts be homogeneous in order to ensure that if one of them takes more effort, it's not because it's objectively more complex than others. It's because the translation quality is lower for this text. So we can go back to my example with Jane and Jack. They work with 3 documents each, right? 3 different documents for each of them, but this set of 3 documents is identical for Jane and Jack. And so document 1 is different from document 2 and document 3, but Jane's document 1 and Jack's document 1 are identical. And so documents are translated by different engines, and suppose document 1 always takes more effort than documents 2 and 3, both from Jane and Jack. If the documents are homogeneous, and we have means to establish that, and document 1 in both cases is translated by engine X, it's an indication that engine X is poorer in its output than engines used to translate documents 2 and 3. But only if all 3 documents are homogeneous. Otherwise, it may be due to the fact that document 1 is just more complex and thus requires more work. So going back to the question, why do we need this homogeneity thing and why bother at all? It's because we need to make sure that all the factors not related to quality are eliminated to a degree possible. So this is why we try to establish this homogeneity metric. Okay. Are there any-
Fantastic.
Yeah. Are there any other questions?
I just have one last question.
Okay.
How did you measure time each post editor spent during your experiment? And what translation or authoring environment was used for post editing?
We use MemSource. Yeah, so MemSource, of course, it's not the only CAD tool that would allow you to measure time and other parameters, but it's useful and convenient because you can use both API calls or UI functionality to get this data. You can easily see the time spent in each segment. You can easily see the edit distance. You can easily see the percentage of segments that were changed by your post editor. So yeah, we went with MemSource. Okay.
Great.
Do we-
That's the last question that we have here.
Well,
Oh, excuse me. I see just a couple of more.
Okay.
Where can we see the recording of this webinar in the future? There are parts I'd love to review for my own better understanding.
Yeah, well, all participants of today's webinar will get their recordings, I think, very shortly. So we'll send it out to all.
Fantastic. And then Adam just wants to make sure that he thanks you and that he will be in touch.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. And thank you.
I also see a hand raised by Carolina Scalona, I think.
Carolina, are you with us?
Yeah, Carolina, if you're with us and you have something on your mind, please speak freely. Okay, maybe just a glitch, or I'm not sure. Okay, so this is it then, right? Thank you all.
Oh, I have one more. I'm sorry,
okay.
just coming in.
Okay, should.
Wondering if you considered switching the text of each machine for one of the translators, i.e. Google's selected text would be given to Amazon for one of the translators.
Okay, give me a sec to wrap my head around it. Would be given to Amazon, one of the translate. I'm not sure I understand the question completely, to be honest. Would be given, Google selected text would be given to Amazon. So again, maybe I should go back to the concept of shuffling these documents and translations. So each of the three documents was translated by all three competitors. Let's put it this way. So document 1 was translated by Google and also by Amazon and also by a human, and the same hosts were document 2 and document 3. So one of our 6 post editors inevitably worked with a document that would be translated by either Google or Amazon. So there were no documents that wouldn't be translated by each of the contestants, so to speak. Yeah. So again, maybe we should go deeper into it, and I'd appreciate it if you could reach out on LinkedIn or otherwise, and we could discuss it in more detail.
I think that concludes the Q&A session for this webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Angie, for your moderation, and thank you everyone for coming. Hope to see you soon and hear from you. Take care.